Okay, as you can see on the screen, I've got a picture of a buffet. And when you go through the buffet line, we all tend to put more on our plate than we can eat. And guess what? We're guilty of this morning. To prepare for this talk, I wanted to cover a lot of disparate topics about things that we think are important that are on the horizon for critical care that we need to deal with. So I talked to a couple of dozen folks, and at the end of this, the food was falling off the plate. So I tried to prioritize these things, but I'm going to probably talk just almost as fast as an auctioneer to try to get through some of this. Each of these topics I will cover very superficially. There's just no time to go into detail here. But the main things I want to do, we'll go through together. So disclosure slide first, as was mentioned. About 6 years or so ago, I retired from Mayo, and when I did that, I decided to just go out and do something completely different. So I have been involved with both volunteer and for-profit activities. I will assure you that none of that reaches a level of conflict of interest here. The majority of what I'm doing is working with developmental things, even the things that are paid activities. And I put a web page up there just so you can see it, not for any other reason than just to be transparent with it. Nothing commercial to be talked about. Okay, so before we get into this, I want to share with you some of my philosophical perspectives about what's important, because it shapes how we will approach some of these issues. So to begin with, you can just walk down the road and see what happens, and you may or may not get where you want to go if you don't know what your destination is. And so I'm going to talk about some waypoints along the way that I happen to think are important. So here is the map for today. So the first one, which is really important to me and has been a very big deal, is what I referred to as critical care training harmonization. And I'm going to go through that with you, probably that topic in the most detail. I have one or two comments about AI because everybody talks about AI. I'm not going to say much there. I've spent a lot of time in resource-limited countries, and I want to talk about the practical approach to how we do problem solving or problem helping in some of these countries. I have an idea that I want to share with you, a single idea about research and some of the things we're doing in the United States, and finally just end up with one specific thing that came up from several different people related to medical preparedness. So our goals today, as we talk about these things, is not to really solve anything, and I'm not going to offer you any solutions or solution ideas, but rather I just want to plant some seeds. It's not going to be me. I'm quickly moving into the codger class. And so what's more important here is maybe some of these ideas I hope you will hear and say, you know, let's dig into this a little further and see if there's something there. So I'm going to suggest some dots. They may be connectable. So let's see what you think as you listen to all of this. So the mantra with small tested changes is exactly this, and I'm going to try to embed this philosophy in the topics that we discussed today. Think big, good thing. Start small, go fast. So while we talk about these big things, I'm going to make some suggestions and dots that are small things to start with. So I ran across this paper a couple of years ago, and I thought it was very interesting, and it's a very cool term, a Zen-tensivist, and how you take a holistic approach to patient care and then merge that together with what we do in our daily lives in critical care and in the ICU. And I have two definitions here, or two phrases to use: holistic with an H, but also holistic with a WH. And I'm going to talk about that in the whole person concept. So the next philosophical point that I'm going to embed in this is here. And we all know about the ICU without walls and rapid response teams, emergency response teams, all of those things. But how about we never get to the point that you need critical care in the first place? We own that. So I've tried to embed some of that as we go through there, because that expands our borders. And so the bumper sticker expression that I've used for a number of years is exactly this: critical care is not a place. It starts at the kitchen table and spans all the way to the ICUs. And so as an example, you may say, what do you mean it starts at the kitchen table? Okay. What about the patient with a VAD, with an LVAD? And in any given day, that person can be sitting at their kitchen table in the morning and intubated in the ICU with 5 different drips running by supper time with what's going on. So these guys they're never very far away from critical care. What is our responsibility to patients like this and others to help to prevent them requiring a need for critical care? So one of the people that I talked to was a guy named Nick Reddy, and he's at Baylor Scott and White Health. Super smart guy, engineer, PhD, and he's in their innovation group. And so he talked to me and showed data, and I'm not going to share the data, we don't have time. But his summary comment, as you can see, was 70 to 80% of all healthcare will be provided outside the walls of healthcare facilities. And his boss that was there with him, who's a pulmonary critical care physician, Alex Aroliga, said, yeah, and you know what? That touches critical care too. So what does that mean? And I, again, don't have an answer for you today, but we're going to have to address this. So I summarize that this way. So our current state, our traditional state, historical state, is that the patients find the care. You've got chest pain. You can't breathe. You've got a funny whatever. So you get on the phone or a conveyance or whatever it may be, and you go find your health care. But really where we need to be is we flip that. The care finds the patient. So how do we do that? And again, I'm not offering you answers with that, but this is where we're going. And in a consumeristic economy, if I can order a pizza and Uber Eats and everything else, this is an expectation of society, that they can connect with healthcare from anywhere to anywhere with what they do. And then the absolute state that we are hoping to achieve is that location and place are not even relevant anymore, and that this continuum of healthcare, including critical care, can reach out wherever. So with that as the philosophy, let's start first with a topic that I think is very, very important, and that I titled as Untangling Our Many Critical Care Medicine Training Pathways. And there's a lot to do here. So I would begin by positing a question to you. Is our current critical care training collage or matrix optimally arranged for the future? And it's a loaded question, so I think all of us would say no, and I want to address that. So here's a word cloud that I made for you, and I just went through and picked out all of the different things that touch critical care training. And so these are boards, these are accrediting agencies, all these different things. And it's a hot mess. I mean, there's just no way to say that other than in a negative way. There are so many people that are involved with this, and what do they all have in common with each other? And that is they're barely talking to each other. Everybody's doing their own thing with this, and everybody wants to add critical care to their pathway and whatever, exclusive to whatever. So where are we going to go? So I have a couple of vignettes for you to share. And I want you, as you look at these, I'm not criticizing the training pathways. I want you to look at these through the eyes of the trainee themselves and what they would do. So here's the first example. Here's somebody that's in an emergency medicine residency, says, you know, I think I want to do critical care. So asks one of their mentors what they want. Hey, so what should I do about this if I want to go do a fellowship? And blah, blah, blah. So there you can see a long answer that comes forth, and I won't read that to you, but I've highlighted some of the key terms in yellow that you can see. 5 pathways, 2-year fellowships, 6 years. Look at all the different things that are there. ABEM, ABIM, ABS, ABA, neurocritical care sponsorship through ABA, all these other things, because before some of these came around, that's how people went to, emergency medicine went to neurocritical care in order to get to critical care with it. Well, how the heck are we supposed to untangle these things? What do we tell that trainee? And beyond that, now if you look at the specifics, what are the core competencies with this? You know, if you think about these folks, that what we're training are extremely high-level technicians and craftsmen for what they do. And you work on watches, these 1,000 jewel watches, and you take them apart and you fix them. And one guy says, oh, I only work on this brand. And the other guy says, oh, I only work on that brand with it. So where's the commonality in all of this? We need to work on it. The same is true for neurocritical care. And again, I picked these 2 out because these are 2 where we have left our trainees with a quandary of how do we approach this. And this one is even a little bit more complicated, not just for the fellowship, but for the residency. So now you have someone coming out who wants to do neurocritical care, which is an amazing career track and field. But it even doesn't even get to the fellowship first. It's even at the residency. What residency do you do if you want to get to neurocritical care? What trains you? What is the scope of practice? Where are you going? Is it going to be neurosurgical patients? Is it general neurocritical care? Is there a generalist pathway with this? Are all these different groups talking together? And look at the bottom of this slide. These are the residency pathways: EM, IM, anesthesia, neurosurgery, surgery, neurology, and PM&R for this are all entry points into neurocritical care. I think that's great. I think all these other pathways, they're fine too, but we've got to develop a communication matrix. And again, I'm just picking out these two, but this applies to many, many different areas of critical care. That's why I called it a tangled web that we need to untangle with this. And then one more group here. If you look as a proportion of the whole of who's doing the highest volume of critical care, the piece of the pie that's increasing the fastest are our hospital medicine colleagues and also our advanced practice professionals with this too. Where do they fit into all of that? Now you start talking about competencies and all these other things. How are we going to bring these folks into this? Where the old trite expression, we're all singing from the same sheet of music. It doesn't have to be identical. So here's the way I've started to break this down. So I took it to the T's: teleology, taxonomy, topology. And probably there's a fourth one that's here, and maybe 4 and 5. And the one that's probably impacted this the most that's not up here is turf, because people have approached that. And then the other one is theology with this. But I'm going to focus on just these three with it. So teleology, where we got to where we are, we're to a place now where with what purpose does critical care serve? Well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the next group that says, you know what, we need some critical care too. Cardiology is doing this right now too with an independent pathway that they're trying to develop with this. So the teleology, what's the reason to be? Why do we exist with this? And what, as we go to the future, does society and our patient population need critical care to be? And that's what should drive these discussions at their core. Taxonomy. So we talked about data dictionaries. Lauren mentioned that during her address on Monday when she talked about it. Why don't we have the equivalent of a data dictionary for critical care training that spells all this stuff out so we're all speaking the same language and we have all the same verbiage of how we refer to this? And finally, topology. Who's going to build the wiring diagram of how this fits together? You can go to tertiary or even quaternary community hospitals with this and look at it and see how people are practicing with what they're doing. What's a generalist intensivist? Are we having just cardiovascular? What about somebody that does nothing but a hem-onc practice in critical care? What about neurosciences, all these different things? How do those fit together? What skills do they need to have? Should we have a core pathway for general critical care, and then these things are subs to that? These are all conversations that need to happen. I've got opinions about these things, but it's not my decision. But we as a profession need to get a hold of this across these boundaries and talk about it and start making some decisions about how it fits together. So here's the reality. We've already laughed at this about the turf, but it's true. There is no chance we're going to go to any one of these boards and say, hey, you know, we're going to centralize this stuff. We need you to relinquish this. That's not going to happen. So within the existing infrastructure, how do we modify this and take it to the next level? And what are the things that are here? So I've mentioned some of these, but these are just the ones off the top of my head that are all actively involved in critical care. The core stuff: general medical, trauma, surgical, sub, cardiovascular, on down the line, and so forth and so on. We need a matrix for this, of how these things fit together. All right, so I want to talk about the next steps with this and what we've been doing. So the obvious thing is, well, by God, we've got to fix this. We've got to make it better. We've got to solve the problem. No, that's the small tested changes that I referred to at the beginning. Don't try to do that. Just make it better, and then we can build on those things. And you're going to see this slide several times through here. So during my time at the American Board of Internal Medicine, we all know this. We don't like to acknowledge it, but we do teach to what we test. I'll give you a quick example. So back in the mid-2000s, around 2005, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there, we're trying to figure out what does point of care ultrasound mean in POCUS with this, and where does this fit into it? Okay, so we put a couple of questions into the live pool, or move them towards the live pool with the ABIM. You've got a patient, they're hypotensive, they've got low urine output, and we showed a couple of static pictures of their inferior vena cava. What do you see? 2/3 of the people got that wrong, and there was a big negative blowback. I don't do that. I don't do ultrasound. We don't need to know these things. Well, guess what? You do. You really do. And so it changed. And so we use this as a lever to push. Is that okay? Well, some would say no. I thought it was with what we did with this, and so we moved forward with it. So starting this with the ABIM, and it was at this meeting in 2020, and we were here, and it was on the Tuesday, the last day of the meeting, or Wednesday morning, actually, what it was. We brought together some people to talk about these things, and we talked about harmonizing. And so you can see I made another word cloud here. All right, so surgery critical care is different from medical critical care, is different from this, is different from that. But guess what? If you're talking about evaluation and management of delirium or sedation practices or some of these other things, no, they're not different. So why do we have all of these differences in the templates across all the various different boards? And you can see these things: initial evaluation of acute kidney injury, principles of nutrition, respiratory monitoring, proper use of blood products. There are dozens of these things that are common across all the boards. Why does everybody reinvent the blueprint for their own on all these different boards? So what we did in 2020 is had everybody hold hands meeting in one of these rooms, and we talked about these things, about what does that look like. And out of this came an SCCM task force. And Sam Tischerman and Tony Spevitz have been leading this activity for us. And so we've been going through a series of things that are here, and we tried to start small. You know, looking at the Venn diagram, where's the overlap point on this? What are all the things that we have in common that I was just showing you? So we've started that process, and we went through several rounds of a Delphi methodology to identify it. And surprisingly, even for some of the things that I thought were common, we couldn't reach a common ground on that, but there were a lot of them that we could. So that manuscript took, many, many months, but that's now past the draft stage and going through the pipeline and the steps that go with that. And that's going to come out. And so we're going to make some suggestions with this very initial baby step publication about beginning to harmonize some of the exam blueprints. It doesn't get us to any of those T's yet, but it moves us in that direction. I think the most important thing with this is that it does, though, is it builds trust. That's another T. For all these people to begin to work together, and that we are on the same team for what we're doing, and we're not trying to take turf away. We're trying to get to some level of commonality with that. Okay, I want to change gears and talk about artificial intelligence. And I kind of had this idea, but I had 2 or 3 people bring it up, and they were much more articulate in it. And it's just one thing, and I want to share it with you. So we're all talking about AI as something that we can use to make all the right diagnoses for patients and clinical solutions and all these things. Well, yeah, I think we're going to get to places where we do a lot of that stuff, but that's a really big bite to take right up front. Is there something that we could do with this first that might help? Again, this slide. So let's take a day in the life of a burned out intensivist or critical care person. You guys live every single one of these bullet points. Is there something that we can do that makes that better? Now, the first response we all have is don't even go there. If you add one more alert dialog box to the EHR, I'm going to throw you out of the room. All that does is make my life worse with this. So I'm not talking about that. So you see all of these things. What might we do? And so I thought about some administrative things. What if we could leverage aspects of AI as a project management tool for rounds? And let me show you this. This is on Zoom, and in Zoom they do that. So you can have an administrative meeting on Zoom, blah, 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 and it's recording it in the background as a scribe to it, and at the end it gives you summaries, it gives you meeting minutes, it tells you key points, all of those kinds. Gosh, that sounds like 24-hour review, organ system review, plan for the day, all that. Sounds very much like that. And then it sends out emails and text messages to people and says, hey, you need to go do this. You signed up for it. This is your homework assignment. We used to call those scut lists with that. So what if we did something like this? What if we developed some sort of generative AI tools that were purely administrative that we could use? And we're not talking about billing and coding now so that we can optimize this. You would focus this directly on the patient care. So every pod, every bed that you go to with your patient is a project management activity with it. And then you do all of these things together. And then it generates a note for you at the end that's editable and those things. You know, that's way better than copy forward with what we're doing right now. Maybe we ought to think about some of these things. So I said, what's out there? And I've got a couple of web pages here, but to avoid the conflict of interest, I chopped off with the screenshots here who owns these things. This is off their web pages, and you can find it. And what I learned was, looking at this, there's a lot of this that's already going on out there, and companies that are coming forward and doing it. But none of them that I can find anyway have made their way to critical care yet. There's a lot of this in primary care and outpatient medicine, a lot of this coming up with scribe-type stuff and the things I talked about for emergency medicine, but I couldn't find much on critical care. So I don't know whether this is a doable thing or not, but I'm putting an idea in front of you guys. This may be something that helps us going forward. Okay, let's change gears again and let's talk about resource-limited countries. And the bumper sticker expression I use for this is resource-limited means resources are limited. And yet we go into these countries and we try to transplant what we do in our own backyards with this into them, and they want that. So why do they want that? And I want to talk about some of those things with that. But this is basically austere medicine and no limited resources, or correction, very limited resources. So again, don't try to fix it. Try to find a way forward with this. And this slide, to me, I think is important, and it's helped me a lot. So a number of years ago, I was invited, I actually helped as a co-chair for an annual meeting for a critical care association in a country in Southeast Asia. And they wanted talks, and so they said, hey, we would like you to give a talk on post-operative complications of liver transplant patients. What? You don't even do liver transplants. You haven't even addressed the cultural and ethical issues of organ donation in your country yet. What do you want to talk about this for? So you figure this out, and here's why. So the first thing that the medical personnel want, just because there's a dirt floor and a bare light bulb, these guys are really smart. They're just as smart as we are. And whether we project condescension on them tonight or not, they perceive that. They perceive the condescension. So they want to talk about the things that you do because it shows their own qualifications and their knowledge base with that. So they want you to acknowledge intellectual parity. They also want you to know that, yeah, we may not do these things, but we're reading the literature too. And we know what it says, and we're able to objectively evaluate it and all the things that go with that. I am your equal peer. And they know they're limited in resources, so they try to use knowledge as a surrogate for resources. So if you understand all of that, and you acknowledge that, and you respect that in the way you work with people, then you can get to what the patients really need. And as you can see on the right-hand slide, they don't want to talk about all, or they want to talk about, but the patients don't need all of these advanced ventilator topics. They want to know that there's only one H cylinder of oxygen for the hospital. And Lauren talked about that too, the project that they're working with. Only one H cylinder. They can't do ventilators in some of these things. They don't even have enough oxygen for it. So what do you do to help them with these things? And I want to share with you some of what we've done. Before I do that, I want to talk about something that is a problem and what's called humanitarian tourism. And I'm not going to summarize this article for you, just show you the title for the effect of seeing it. But the bottom line is good intentions are not enough for this. And yet we go in. Was in Haiti after the earthquake. So they had a big tent where they were gathering all these supplies that people had shipped to them to help out. So I walk up to this big pallet, and there's these huge cardboard boxes on it. I said, well, what are these? Oh, well, those are balloon catheters from an interventional radiology department that were expired, and they didn't need them anymore. so they shipped them down there for them. Well, that's great. You get a tax write-off, and I'm being cynical about this. You get all of these things with it, but what about those guys in Haiti? What do they have to do? Well, where are they going to put all that stuff? They had this tent full of these kinds of things with it. That doesn't help anybody. It's high technology, but it doesn't help them with where they're going with that. So you have to ask yourself these questions when you look at it. Do my actions have unintended negative consequences? Are you teaching people to how to handle these problems, or are you just going in and fixing a bunch of stuff and then you leave, and what happens to the patients after you leave? Is it self-inurement with this? And the bottom one there, which is also cynical, is when you stick this up on your webpage and say, find us on Facebook. Well, then we know what your motivations are with this. Maybe not, you're just sharing lots of selfies. None of that is good with this, so that's not where you want to be with it. So this is a great thing to teach residents about gas flow and all the interactions and equation of motion and all of it. So we go in, sit with these guys, PowerPoint slides, and, and show them all this stuff. We're projecting onto a white sheet, and we talk about all of this stuff. Not saying that's not important in the big scheme of things, but this doesn't help them with their day-to-day stuff. This does. And so what you see here, it's small, but a schematic about sepsis. And remember up front I said critical care is not a place. The best critical care is the critical care you never need. This is what resource-limited countries need. They need to not get to this in the first place. So what does that process map look like? It looks like this. So where is sepsis developed for these patients? It's in unserved areas like that, not just underserved, but unserved areas with this, triage and advanced care. So if you're designing a system to help these people, what does that look like? It's not measuring the lactate. It's not giving large boluses of fluid with this. It's not 1 hour bundles. It's none of those things. If you're to that stage of their illness, you are so far behind you're never going to catch up. You have to get out in front of this before these things ever happen. So at our Critical Care Congress in 2013 in Puerto Rico, under the auspices of the Surviving Sepsis Campaign, Martin Dunzer from Austria, representing the SCCM, and me from the SCCM, we said, all right, well, what if we made bundles for resource-limited countries? What does that look like? And let me show you a couple of slides with this. So we developed with our group a methodology we called Scan, Teach, Treat with that. And we put limits on this. We didn't talk about intubating and airway management. It was putting people in a rescue position. It was trying to help them when you were still giving them oral fluids and oral hydration and oral medications before we got to the high-level stuff with this. So that algorithm looked like this. So it starts with the scan, the environmental scan that you see at the top. Well, what does that mean? If you think about disaster medicine, which, by the way, this is, the first thing you do in disaster planning is a hazard vulnerability analysis. You go into the area and you say, well, what are the risks here? Oh, they've got a train that comes through the middle of the town carrying hazmat chemicals twice a day. All right, when you make your disaster plan, you better account for that and what you're going to respond for. Oh, the number one thing that we're seeing that's causing problems are little kids under the age of 4 with malaria. All right, so when we make our plan for that, for critical care prevention, you need to think about that. And that's front and center for what you do. Then the next thing regarding the prevention of critical care, what's the biggest element of the bundle? It's education. And it's not in the hospital. It's where you saw the triage. It's in the tents. It's in the bad parts of town. It's all of those things. And that's critical care. It's teaching people, how do we recognize badness before it becomes overt badness? What does that look like? And how can we help them? And then the third thing is the sepsis treatment, but it's limited. So here's just one poster as an example, and it's eye-catching, but this is what we were putting, this kind of things into the dispensaries so that they could look at it, and people would stop and read these. And when we taught classes, we did hands-on workshop things with this around this very thing. So when people showed up at a dispensary, we were trying to help them recognize the badness before it became overt. And this is critical care. It's not ventilators, but this is critical care. The other thing we did under the treat is we developed what we call the sepsis first aid kit. And so you can see the basic elements that were in there. So first and foremost, there were a lot of educational materials that were there, of what was there, but it was down all the way to the bottom before, last bullet, before you see what was in there. There was an IV fluid set, a couple of those that were there, an infusion set, some IV fluids, oral rehydration salts, and a daily dose of an adequate antibiotic. And we based that on the hazard vulnerability analysis, the environmental scan. What were the things that you needed in there? Now, if you go too far and you load this up with too many things, not the healthcare people, but this becomes a theft item. So there's a balance point in here of what do you do so that you can give people the basics but keep things moving forward and that these don't end up somewhere else. Then what we also did, and this is the example that mainly focused on malaria, is we put it on one laminated card in their language. So aside from the teaching, the point of care learning was all right here. So the entirety of the sepsis management fit on the one card with that. So again, I'm giving you some ideas. Now I know that the SCCM now has got a grant from the World Health Organization, and we're getting into this again, and there's enough money. We did everything I just showed you. We did this in Gitwe, Rwanda. We did it with $80,000, the entire project with $80,000. I believe the SCCM has $750,000 for what they're going to do right now. But I hope this is not lost. I hope that some of this philosophy is embedded with where they go, with things going forward. Okay, research, next thing. And this is my expression for the description of research, but I want to just talk about one thing, and it's another idea. So here's a quote from Steve Jobs. Everybody uses this, and he talks about creativity and how people come up with things. And he talks about dot connecting with this. So I want to talk about that for a second too. So my question first with you is, all right, we're going to do research. Who are our dot finders and dot connectors to decide what's the important things that we should be doing in research? Because the same way people teach to what they test, these guys define the priorities, and that's what they fund with where things are. So what that looks like, and you'll see this quote several times, I've used it, and this is mine at the top. Vision isn't about seeing the future. Vision is recognizing relationships that others don't see. And reaching beyond healthcare and other things, this is all about dot connecting and how we do this. And so I've got some things here for you to consider. And it's contrarian. Some of this is contrarian. So the first, recognize that sometimes subject matter expertise becomes a constraint. You see what you see. What is important that we've not thought about yet? And what's within our field of vision? Where are those boundaries? How do we push that out beyond it? And what's the role of creativity? So think about how we do research now. We have a series of people that are experts that decide the funding. We have study groups. We have all of these things. They come together, and then where they put the money is where it drives the direction. Are they getting a representative cross-section of what's going on? Well, yeah, in some ways. No, in some ways. So is there something that we could do that might expand that field of vision with that? So at the bottom, what you see here, and this is also with the funding, and I've seen this through some family members that we have, one that's a physician scientist in particular. All right, so he's funded, somebody else is funded, and they should work together, they should share because there's overlap. Well, guess what? That doesn't always happen. I'm not going to show you my data. What if you take this away? Because what about the next grant? What about these things? And again, that's cynicism that's there. But we have to acknowledge that some of this exists. And if we want to take this to the next level of what we're doing, we have to find a way that we make it totally okay for people to collaborate with this, and a little bit less competition and a little bit more collaboration with it. So I talk about a research milieu where wonder and skepticism can co-create. And co-create is a popular term in a lot of process literature right now. We talk about it in medicine where the patients and the healthcare professionals work together to co-create solutions to things. And so the same thing here, I think, plays out for research too. And I think we need an everyday place that is unconstrained for any dot finder to potentially become a dot connector with this. For collaboration, not not competition with this, to celebrate creativity, that okay is, maybe is okay with these things. And it's not, you say, well, yeah, that sounds a lot like an incubator. Well, it has features of an incubator, but it's not exactly the same thing as that. So here's what I see, and I'm going to put this forward to some people within the SCCM, but a web page for these things. And these kinds of idea sharing platforms, they exist, but something with some rules. Open access, creative community, well, we've got that, but not exactly this. Dreamers welcome. Research pedigree not required. I think that one's really important. There's a lot of people that don't regularly do research that have some really good ideas. How do we hear those people? How do we interact with those people? And what's out there? So something like this potentially may be helpful. Another Apple-ism there, think different in what they did. Not think differently, but think different. Okay. All right, so there are some platforms, some software platforms that are out there. Maybe we can do that. I'm close. All right, pandemic preparedness. We're going to change gears one more time. I had one point that came up over and over, and I just want to share this with you. So this is my opinion. The concern that another large global respiratory pandemic is going to occur. I'm not going to say it's not the if and the when thing that we talk about with that, but I think there's a high probability that we're going to get there again with that. So the way I look at this, specifically with the PPE aspects of it, there's a lot of things in life that we describe with the concentration gradient. And we put an enormous burden on simple surgical masks to be a barrier to a concentration gradient. There was no way that could ever be adequate. It didn't matter whether it was one of them or 10 of them. It wasn't going to work. And so what I want to show you is what some people have talked to me about of so-called multimodal or layered approach to this. It's not going to argue masks, no masks, any of that stuff, but rather what can we do to augment and increase the efficacy of these techniques with this. So what we need to do first and foremost, the obvious thing, is lower the environment to the individual concentration gradient. So how do you do this? And I've talked about the masks, the multimodal approach to this. So here's what I've seen, and these exist. All right, we make negative flow rooms. They're expensive. You put them in. But in industry, with clean rooms, they've used this forever. During SARS, when that happened, they did some of this, but they didn't have the UV light part of it, so they were exhausting this out the window with it. And other people on other floors got SARS from this because it was a highly contagious organism with that. But this is a high-grade HEPA filtration, many air exchanges per hour system down to the micron particle size with it, but it has a very high output UVC light associated with it. So within seconds, it kills all the particles that are in there. The picture on the left that I've got there was during COVID. That's the lobby of a Hilton hotel. And you can't tell the size from that, but that device is about 6 or 8 feet tall with it. And it did about 8 or 10 air exchanges an hour. This doesn't solve the problem, but it lowers the concentration gradient. So then when you stack this with other things, it may be helpful. A lot of these things are on wheels, and so this came up over and over. Okay, so last time. This is last 2 slides. One more time about the vision thing. For me, this is really, really important. One example I give you that we haven't worked on, quality improvement. How do we do that? Well, let's look at the people that do credit card fraud. Just use that as an example. They deal with billions of those things, and yet they have algorithms that are highly accurate, not 100%, but highly accurate with screening it. Why aren't we talking to those guys? Why are we talking to them about surveillance within our own healthcare systems and studying some of their algorithms, and do those dots potentially connect with us? Okay, so last slide here. I'm done. You're not. Thank you very much.